Joshua 11 and 12 today. We may make it to 13, though I kind of doubt it given the time. So before we jump into 11, I want to say a couple things to create some context. Obviously, right, we've seen a lot of battles, cities destroyed, things burned to the ground, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this has kind of caused some people to worry about the book of Joshua. And their question is, well, Joshua seems to be about, some kind of holy war, and it seems to be about genocide. And, is this where kind of like religious people, is this where all their violence comes from and, all that? So I want to deal with that question before we move on. Just a couple things. Obviously, this could turn into like a huge, long discussion, and whole books have been written on this, but I'm going to try and deal with it in 5 minutes. So here it is. So one thing I think we just want to be aware of, if this really were a story about sort of genocide and a holy war in sort of like the normal sense of that term, what we would expect to see is that as Joshua sort of conquered all these places, beginning with Jericho and moving on down, what we would expect to find is Joshua becoming king of all these places. But of course, that's the one thing that doesn't happen, right? There's no intimation ever in the book of Joshua that Joshua is sort of arriving to sort of set up his own sort of like rival or personal kingdom, right? We're gonna wipe out the Canaanites' way of order, and we're gonna place it with mine, where I'm gonna be in charge, right? That never happens. So what we have to do is we have to look at things from a theological perspective, and this is where things get deep and complicated. I'll just say once again, I'll try and be very brief. I think one of the things that we want to see as the background for the book of Joshua is actually the same background that is operative in the book of Genesis. And it's the Old Testament's theology of creation. Remember, and this is important for us to remember that in Genesis and all the way throughout the rest of the Bible, creation does not simply mean that God sort of like made the world and now it just kind of runs on its own. It means far more than that. Creation means that not only has God created the universe, He is also its king. And if things are going to be properly ordered in that universe, they must be ordered according to His purposes, and this is why sin is such a problem. Okay? So remember, just kind of briefly retracing the history of the Genesis, right? Remember, we have the events of the story of the Garden of Eden, and remember kind of what happens after that, right? We get the story of Cain and Abel, where we have people locked in violent conflict. And then by the time we arrive at Genesis 6, right, we have that note right at the beginning of the chapter that God sees His creation, which in Genesis 1 He's pronounced good, and now He beholds it, and the comment there, right, is that the world is filled with violence and it's become corrupt. This wonderful thing that God's made has now, in effect, is in the process of like destroying itself because the human-God relationship has been broken. So what has to happen, right, is God's order now needs to be reasserted in things. And that's actually part of what the book of Joshua is about. So the book of Joshua isn't about Joshua conquering people and like killing all of them. The book of Joshua really is the story about the initial establishment of God's kingdom and God's rule, which has to take place and supplant the culture and religion and political order of the Canaanite city-states. That's why we've seen so much emphasis on the kings being killed and hung on trees and things like that, right? It's a way of rolling that order aside and God's order being established. Now, there's a couple helpful ways I think we can kind of think about this. Both of them are in the Psalms, so just going to give you two examples. Psalms 97 and 99. Both of them make really important points. I'll read to you part of Psalm 97 because it's certainly operative in the background here. Just listen to the language. This is Psalm 97, 1 and following. The Lord reigns, let the earth rejoice. Let the coastlands be glad, clouds and thick darkness are around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Fire goes before him and burns up his adversaries all around. His lightnings light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax before the Lord of the earth. The heavens proclaim his righteousness, and all the peoples see his glory. Notice this, all the peoples, not just Israel, all the peoples see his glory. All worshipers of images are put to shame, who make their boast in worthless idols. Worship him, all you gods. Zion hears and is glad, and the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgments, O Lord. So just stop there. Notice the psalm begins by making what you might want to think of as one of Israel's creedal affirmations. Is just as we say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. The creedal affirmation here in the 97th Psalm is, the Lord reigns. Let the earth rejoice. That is, God's not only the creator, he's also the king, the Lord of everything that he's made. And that's not just sort of like, well, that's really interesting. That's actually the source of creation's hope. So here's the thing. It's very unfortunate, maybe even like fatal, that we've come in some parts of the church today to see God's mercy and God's judgment as somehow like opposites, right? Almost as if, there are some days where God's having a good day, and that's when he's merciful, and on other days he's like having a bad day, and that's when he decides to exercise judgment. No. In God, mercy and judgment are all part of the same holiness of God. So here's one way to think about it. God's mercy and judgment are always simultaneously operative. God's love is always operative. But judgment and wrath are God's love experienced against sin and evil. That's a really important point, okay? God sort of doesn't look at his creation, in this case, the alternative civilization of Canaanite society, and say, well, gosh, they're unfortunate people down there, but hey, the city of Ai is really neat. And the shopping district's really neat. They got a bit of high-end department stores, Okay, let's leave them alone. No. When we talk about God's wrath and we talk about God's judgment, those are always good things because the opposite of God's wrath is not God's love. The opposite of God's wrath is God's indifference. Do you see the difference? Without judgment and without wrath, what we would really be saying is that God simply didn't care. And therefore, for both the Old Testament and the New Testament, God's wrath and judgment are really, really good. Because they're signs that God refuses to allow his creation to simply spin out of control and then blow itself up or whatever's going to happen. In effect, right, God's judgment and God's wrath are God's way of saying, no. This is my creation. You guys don't own it. You're merely creatures. I am not going to let you destroy it. Okay? It actually works well with the epistle lesson that we had this morning. Remember that wonderful passage from Paul's letter to the Romans? Nothing will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Because God's determined that's the way it's going to be. Okay, so that's a really important thing. So one final thing by way of this. There's a sense here in which Joshua is doing something that's theologically very important. One, The book of Joshua is allowing us to see what God's goal is. It's the establishment of his kingdom, which involves the uprooting and the demolition of all competing sovereignties, regardless of what they are, whether they're human or supernatural. And that's good. Okay, so that's a really important thing. And the second thing that Joshua is allowing us to see that's also really good is that God here is intent on spreading this kingdom throughout the world. That is, it's going to start with Israel, but that's not where it's going to stay. It is going to spread through all the world. So remember, there's that one moment in the first chapter of the book of Acts where the disciples who still don't quite get the resurrection, remember they asked Jesus that it's kind of like an embarrassing question. Remember they say to him, Jesus, the resurrection thing was really neat. And we're so happy that you're not dead anymore. But when are you going to get your act together and restore the kingdom to Israel? That's what we really want. And Jesus says, basically. And then he says, I want you to stay in Jerusalem till you receive the promise of my Father, and you'll become my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Notice, really important point. There's not a word in the message to the disciples about conquering anything. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, right? I'm sending you out as witnesses, but I'm the one that's going to do the kingdom establishment. Okay, so just go with that. Okay, let's take a quick look at Joshua 11. And what happens now is that the story now turns to the north. We've seen a lot of things happening in the south. Now we're going to move north. And here's what happens. Once again, the Canaanite city-states hear what's going on to the north, and they get together to mount a sort of united opposition against Joshua. And here's part of what happens in Joshua 11:1. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, that is the defeat of the last couple kings, he sent to Jobab, the king of Madon, and the king of Shimron, and the king of Achshaph, to the kings who were in the northern hill country and the Arabah south of Chinnerat, in the lowland, and to Nephilim in the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, to the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they came out with all their troops, a great horde in number, like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And all these kings joined their forces and came and encamped together at the waters of Mermon to fight against Israel. So here's this kind of like this frightening scene, right? Where this enormous army gathers from all these Canaanite city-states, and you get a sense of what's involved here, right? So you've got these city-states, and then just to kind of round things out, you've got the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Hivites, the Tallahasseites, all the ites that are out there, right? They've all coming together, and they've gathered this huge army. And once again, right, latest military technology, bronze armor, bronze weaponry, chariots, the whole 9 yards. And they've gathered together in this huge mass, and now they're sort of like advancing on the people of Israel. And we're told here that the troops are a great horde, so that they sort of numbered almost like the sands on the seashore. There's so many of them. Okay, this is like petrified. Now, some of you may have seen the movie that was made that the BBC did about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Remember, there's the combat scene there. Remember where Peter, the High King, is sort of leading Aslan's forces against the forces of the White Witch, and she's sort of assembled this sort of supernatural army of like demons and all sorts of creatures, and they're coming at Aslan's forces, and it's kind of the same thing. It's like it's overwhelming. And the movie, I think, does a great job because you get a look at Peter's face, and Peter's got his armor on, and he's kind of like looking out at this like advancing army, and you can just see the look on his face that kind of says, he's like afraid, and justifiably so, right? Well, here's what happens. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them, slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." So Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly against the enemy by the waters of Mermon and fell upon them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as Great Sidon to Mishrepoth-Maim and eastward to the valley of Mizpeh. And they struck them until they had left none remaining. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord had said to them, hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. So this is, once again, right, we've seen a pattern now in the battles, right? So the thing that carries the day, clearly, right, is not Joshua's military brilliance or the military might of Israel. Rather, it's the intervention of God. And it's really important to notice the way the story ends. The story ends with Joshua burning these chariots. It is, in effect, right, this is like, the chariot is sort of like the latest, most fearsome sort of piece of military hardware. Kind of like, the latest tank or the latest missile or something like that, right? The battle ends with Joshua burning these things, right? Almost as a way of saying, where real strength lies is not like in these armies or this military technology or these chariots or whatever, right? The real strength here comes from God, who's promised to deliver the armies over to Israel and actually does so. Then they move on to the big city that kind of was at the center of this coalition in Joshua 11:10. And Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor. Hazor is sort of like a major, Hazor would sort of be almost like the Chicago of Canaan or something like that, right? And they struck it with the sword, all who were in it, devoting them to destruction. And there was none that breathed. And he burned Hazor with fire, and the cities of those kings and all the other kings Joshua captured and struck them with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of God, had commanded. So now the city, which is sort of the symbol of Canaanite power, now that's destroyed too. So we've got military technology destroyed. We've got the walled city, that's destroyed too, symbol of Canaanite military power. And then it's interesting here, notice what happens next. This is Joshua 11:15. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua. And so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So really, really important point here. Once again, we're told that the thing that's important about Joshua here is not that he's a brilliant military strategist or something like that, or that he even has miles and miles of courage. The really important thing about Joshua, the thing that makes him stand out, the really significant thing about him for the book of Joshua is that he is obedient. Everything that Moses commanded him, he does. Everything the Lord commands him, he does. Now, I know that in our culture, right, the word obedience can be like a bad word, right? It's like, okay, everyone who wants to sign up for obedience, raise your hand, and one person raises their hand, and the only reason why they raise their hand is because they misheard what I said, right? It's really important that we understand what obedience means here in this context. Here in the Old Testament, it's really important to understand that faith and obedience are organically connected. They're not separable, okay? To believe and trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is simultaneously to obey him. If you don't obey him, that means you don't really believe or trust in him, okay? Let me give you an example. Remember way back, many years ago, this was probably, I think, during when Lyndon Johnson was in the White House. Remember, we talked about the book of Exodus. And one of the things we found there, right, was that when, or in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 12, God calls Abraham to leave his hometown, to leave his family, and to go, well, wherever God shows him. Now imagine Abraham saying to God, okay, God, look, I believe that you are omniscient, omnipotent, the creators of the heavens and the earth, that you're the most wonderful thing in the whole universe, but I'm not leaving here. The refusal to leave would imply that he actually didn't believe what he just said. So it's really important, right, to understand that there's really central connection between faith and obedience. Faith yields obedience, okay? So when we say that Joshua is obedient, we're simultaneously also saying that he's also faithful. And that's why he's held up here. And once again, as I've been trying to make the point, right, Joshua here is a prefiguration of the obedient one, Christ, right? So one of the things the Gospels will emphasize over and over again, right, is Christ's perfect obedience. His complete living into the Father's mission, not out of a sense of duty or obligation or anything like that, right? But because, right, that because Father and Son both completely operate out of the same love and the same agenda, okay? So Joshua's faithfulness is pointing forward to the perfect faithfulness of Christ. So that's a really important note. One final thing about chapter 11 that I wanted to note, or actually two things that I just want to note here, and that is that in 11:20 we're told, "For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts," it is the hearts of the Canaanite kings, "that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction and should not receive mercy but be destroyed." Now, remember, of course, where we've heard this language about the hardening of the heart, right? That was way back in Exodus. And we did Exodus, I think during the first Nixon administration. You remember, right, that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, meaning, right, not that God sort of like forced Pharaoh to do something that he would never ever do. Not that, Pharaoh was a kind, generous, and loving monarch who was perfectly willing to let the people of Israel go until God hardened his heart. No. It's that God kind of took Pharaoh's stubbornness and pride and just kind of pushed it further as a way of saying, well, let's see where stubbornness and pride get you to, right? And so there's that remark, remember, that one of the Egyptian courtiers makes towards the end, right before the people of Israel leave. The courtier says to the Pharaoh, kind of like with a slight embarrassment and a little bit of fear, right? Says in effect, after all these plagues hit, don't you think you ought to let them go now that Egypt is destroyed? It's just like, let's get rid of these people. So there's a warning here, right, about kind of pride, hardness of heart, refusal to give it. The last thing I just want to note is we have a really important note here in 11:21 about Joshua carrying on a battle against the Anakim. And remember, we met the Anakim way back in the book of Numbers. Numbers 13. This is sort of like remember that it was kind of like a race of giants, or they were at least perceived to be giants, right? Who knows? Really important note here. Joshua's battle against the giants isn't just sort of like, once again, like a great military feat. But this is another note that the purpose of this battle is not just to destroy stuff. It's to begin the process of putting creation back into the order that it should be in. And these Anakim, these giants, actually shouldn't be walking around. That is, they were kind of like the result of human sinfulness. All right, so all signs of human sinfulness that we see going down that means God's rule is coming in. Maybe one quick way of illustrating that. Remember the first thing that Jesus does, his first act of ministry in the Gospel of Mark, is an exorcism. That is, it's the same principle, right? You have this demon-possessed man in the synagogue. With the casting out of the demon, right? This is yet another sign that creation is being put back into its proper order, right? This sort of thing shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have demons, turning people's lives into destruction. That shouldn't be. And when it's being undone, that's a sign that God's kingdom is arriving and taking over, and that's really good news. Okay, what we'll do next Sunday is we'll take a quick look at Joshua 12, 13, and 14. There's some brief things I want to say, and that'll kind of propel us then past the middle of the book.